Cvatu behari, kad dunja luk zamiri, duša čežnjom procvili. Davno smo se rastali.
My name's Lorna Hood and I'm privileged to be the chair of the Scottish Board of Remembering Srebrenica. Tonight I think is one of the last events of over 400 events that have been held up and down the country. And I am delighted that we are here in this lovely place, St Mungo Museum. Srebrenica. Srebrenica, a place where pain and anger meet with determination and fortitude. Srebrenica, a place where injustice and prejudice meet with grace and kindness. Srebrenica, a place where evil and the deepest despair meet with the belief in the triumph of love over hate, and that even in the deepest of darkness, a light will always shine, and that light can never ever be put out in the deepest of darkness. Love. Love will always find a way, and love will always triumph. Srebrenica becomes part of you. Ask any of my friends and they'll tell you. Because when you come back from Srebrenica, you want to tell the tale and you want to pledge that it will never happen again, and do all that you can to be part of that. So tonight we remember 8,372 men and boys, mostly, systematically massacred, buried in mass graves, and then dug up and reburied in graves all over the countryside. Some of those graves to this day have never ever been found. But tonight especially we remember the thousands of victims, women and girls, some as young as 12, who were subjected to rape, sexual violence and torture itself. Many, many have remained silent through stigma, through fear and through shame. But tonight we will hear from Bakira Hasečić and also from Kezia Dugdale, who visited with me just a few weeks ago. Those of us who have met with Bakira have immediately been taken by a woman of great resolve, great determination, a woman that we can only stand back and admire for what she has done and what she continues to do. We are just so delighted that you are with us this evening. And I would now ask you, along with Rashad, to bring your message to us.
Jednog dana je moj komšija policajac Veljko ušao u moju kuću u pratnji srpskih vojnika. Bili su naoružani do zuba, tražili su novac. Pokušala sam urazumiti Veljka, ali se on ponašao kada me ne poznaje.
Before the war, I lived with my husband and 2 daughters in Visegrad. I had lived there happily for more than 20 years and had a good life. But when the war broke out, my Visegrad became hell. One day, my neighbor Veljko came to my house with 2 Serb soldiers. They were heavily armed and demanding money. I tried to reason with Veljko, but he behaved as if he never knew me.
Jedan od vojnika potom je silovao moju stariju kćerku. Predanom i pred mojim mužem. Ja sam pokušala odbraniti, ali su oni bili naoružani, a mi ne. Nakon toga sam poslala kćerke kod moje majke u naselje Kosovo polje, a ja sa suprugom smo odlučili da ostanemo u Višegradu. Više puta sam odvođena i saslušavana u stanicu policije u Višegradu. Tu sam silovana. Ponekad se pitam kako sam uopće preživjela rat i sve ono što sam vidjela. Na kraju suprug i ja smo uspjeli pobjeći iz naše kuće u Višegradu.
One of the soldiers then raped my oldest daughter right in front of me and my husband. I tried to fight him over, but they were armed and we weren't. I sent my daughters then to stay with my mother in a settlement called Kosovo Polje, and my husband and I tried to stay in our Visegrad. More than once, I was taken to the police station in Visegrad to be interrogated, and I was raped there. Sometimes, I don't know how we survived the war and the things that we saw during that time, but we did. Eventually, my husband and I had to leave our Visegrad.
Ali čak nakon rata naš pakao nije završen. Mnogi od nas želi smo se vratimo svojim kućama, ali kada smo odlazili da posjetimo kuće, bili smo pod pratnjom policije. To su bili isti oni bivši vojnici. I svaki put kad bi dolazili u Višar, mi bi preživljavali i prepoznavali nekoga među tim policajcima, prepoznavali bi one koji su nas silovali, ubijali nas i našu familiju. Gledali smo ubice silovatelje, kako nam se u lice smiju. Isto tako kako su nas silovali i provocirali, nešto se u meni počelo rasti i ja sam znala da nešto moram učiniti.
But even after the war had ended, our hell wasn't over. Many of us wanted to return to our homes, but when we went to visit our homes, we were escorted by police officers. These police officers were ex-army men, and every time we went to Visegrad, us survivors would recognize some of these officers. They were the same people who had murdered or raped us and our families. We saw our rapists, the murderers of our loved ones, laugh in our faces. As they taunted us, something rose up inside of me, and I knew I had to do something.
Morala sam prekinuti šutnju kako bi svi zlikovci, šta su oni zlikovci uradili, i tako sam počeli prikupljati informacije od drugih preživjeli o ratnim zločincima koji žive i rade u Višegradu. I počela sam slati informacije nadležnim organima i vlastima. Napokon su ljudi počeli bivati osuđeni za djela koja su počinili.
I had to break the silence on what these people had done. And so, I started gathering information from other survivors about those war criminals who still lived in Visegrad. And I started sending these informations to the authorities. Finally, people started to be prosecuted for what they did during the war.
2003. godine par žena i ja smo osnovali udruženje žene žrtve rata kako bi ispričale naše priče i tražile pravdu za ono što nam se desilo. Do današnjeg dana radili smo sa ženskim i muškim žrtvama silovanja iz 73 općine širom Bosne i Hercegovine. Radili smo sa ženama koji su bošnjačke, hrvatske, srpske i romske populacije. I sve žrtve su dobro došle u naše udruženje bez obzira na naciju i vjeru.
In 2003, a few other women and I founded the Women Victims of War Association to tell our stories and to seek justice for what happened to us. To date, we have worked with both female and male victims of sexual violence from over 73 different municipalities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We work with women who are Bosniak, Croat, Serb and Roma. All victims are welcome in our association, no matter for the religion or ethnicity.
Ono što želim da naglasim ovdje je da su 98% žena sa kojima radimo Bošnjakinje, što dokazuje da je genocidno silovanje počinjeno na velikom broju žena Bošnjakinja, da je bilo planirano i sistematski izvođeno tokom agresije na Bosnu i Hercegovinu. To je bio projekat bliži planiran i izvršen od strane onih koji su htjeli da nas ponize, da nas unište. Silovanje je korišteno kao oružje u ratu kako bi ljudi napustili svoje boravište i živjeli u strahu od silovatelja i živjeli u stigmi i pod stigmom koju silovanje sobom nosi.
What I would like to highlight, though, is that 98% of the victims we see are Bosnian Muslim women, which proves that genocidal rape was committed on a large scale and in a very systematic way during the aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was a project which was carefully planned and executed by the perpetrators. They wanted to humiliate us, to destroy us. Rape was used as a weapon of war to make people leave their homes and live in fear of rape and the stigma and the shame that it produces.
Želimo poslati poruku svim ženama koji su prošle kroz torturu i silovanja da razbiju stigmu i da se oslobode srama, da se bore za pravdu, da svjedoče onome što im se dogodilo. Sram i stigma koje okružuju seksualne zločine su mogući samo zato jer im to omogućava naše društvo. Mi se moramo udružiti da se zajedno suprotstavimo na način na kojem je društvo tretira žrtve seksualnog zločina i da stid prebacimo na počinioce zločina.
We are sending a message to all women who have survived torture and rape to break free of the stigma and shame, to fight for justice, to testify about what has happened to them. The shame and stigma that surrounds sexual violence is possible only because our societies make it possible. We have to come together to challenge the way we treat survivors of sexual violence and to put the shame and responsibility onto the perpetrators.
Kada sam se prvi put vratila u moj Višegrad, imala sam osjećaj da se moram sklanjati, sakrivati od ratnih zločinaca koji su nam htjeli uništiti živote. Ali danas kad odem u moj Višegrad, ja hodam visoko uzdignute glave i nadam se da će drugi preživjeli smoći snage da urade isto kao ja.
When us survivors first started returning to Visegrad, we felt that we had to hide from these war criminals who had tried to destroy our lives. But now, when I go to Visegrad, these war criminals hide from me. Now, when I return to my Visegrad, I hold my head high, and I hope that one day all survivors will find their strength to do the same.
Samo bih dodala jednu rečenicu. Ja sam samo jedna od hiljade silovanih žena tokom agresije na Bosnu i Hercegovinu na čelu ove nevladne organizacije.
I'm only one of thousands and thousands raped women in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the aggression. I am the chair of this association.
Hvala.
Thank you.
Ništa me ne boli, samo mi se srcu rana povrijeđuje stara. Ništa me ne boli, samo mi se srcu rana povrijeđuje stara. Jer me ti
only just a few weeks ago. In fact, just a couple of days after the general election. But since then, she has worked tirelessly for us, lighting a candle at the National Memorial event down in London and organising this afternoon's event for Bakira, which I know meant so much to Bakira. It was a very emotional time at the library. And I'm immensely grateful for her support now and indeed her friendship. Kez wrote an article for the Glasgow Herald about her trip. She actually wrote it on the plane back from Amsterdam. That was the plane that you didn't get on, Gail, but had to get the next one. But she wrote that article on the plane in 35 minutes while I kept quiet. We're not sure that the amazing thing was writing the article or me keeping quiet for that length of time. But it was quite simply an amazing piece of work, and get a copy of it on the internet, because it tells the story so well of one of our victims. And Paul Hutchin also wrote a quite amazing article in the Sunday Herald just after that, a very, very full article. That's the way it affects you. You come back and you want to know what you can do and how you can do something and how you can be of help. And you know the people that will go and it will affect them, but life takes over and other pressures take over, and those who will stay committed and be committed and do all that they can. Kez is co-founder of the 50-50 movement. She is passionate about justice and women's issues, and really no other introduction. Kez.
Beslan, Hillsborough, Aleppo, Lockerbie, Rwanda, Sandy Hook, Mogadishu, Dunkirk, Orlando, and Dunblane. They're all places, beautiful places, that are now defined by some horrific atrocity or violent act that happened in those places, towns, villages, cities, and countries. And as I was driving over from Edinburgh this afternoon, I started to think about just how very sad that was, that something done by somebody else as an act of violence could define a whole place forevermore. So before I talk to you tonight about my experiences of being in Bosnia and in Sarajevo, I want to tell you first of all how beautiful a country it is. I know there'll be many people in this room who have visited before now, but if you haven't, please do go. It's just stunning. Sarajevo itself sits in a valley with a river running through it, surrounded by the most beautiful forests and countryside that surround the entire valley. And one of the first things we did when we got there was stand at the vantage point at the top and look over the city of Sarajevo, and to be struck by its beauty was quite awe-inspiring. The skyline was made up of church spires and minarets, side by side, corner by corner, the most beautiful architecture, the most beautiful buildings. It was very apparent quite early on how literal the phrase "the siege of Sarajevo" was, the raining down of missiles on the town, because it is surrounded, it's in a valley. You could see how the Serbian forces could surround it and just shell on it so indiscriminately. It has beautiful cobbled streets made up of cafes and shops where people sit outside their shops and do the most incredible, intricate things with copper, making coffee pots and various designs. There is a cafe culture where you see, we were there just towards the end of Ramadan, and around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night when the sun was going down, we saw groups and groups of young Muslim women with the most stunning, bright-coloured headscarves, sitting enjoying coffee next to cafes and bars where people were drinking alcohol, so completely at peace, so completely integrated. The potential of that was just incredible. You've also heard tonight just how rich in culture Bosnia is. We've heard from the National Theatre of Sarajevo, and it's worth remembering that the National Theatre continued to operate right throughout the war as the missiles were raining down on the city. There's also a real passion and love for education in Sarajevo and in Bosnia. We heard stories whilst we were away about how teachers were very often more likely to be killed than others because they were the ones running between the buildings in Sarajevo trying to teach the children. And rather than gather all the children in one place in front of the teacher, that was perceived to be too dangerous, so the teachers went and found the children instead. We also heard stories about how individuals with very little living in the centre of Sarajevo would trade the food that they had for an education, bags of sugar exchanged for lessons in English or German. And I think that tells you just so very much about the people of Bosnia. It is without doubt a beautiful country, but as one person described it to me whilst I was there, the people are polluted. The people are polluted by their pain. And you've heard some of that pain tonight. And the theme of this year's Remembering Srebrenica is gender and the genocide. And we've heard from Bakira, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Bakira, but also two other women that I met on the trip who speak to that idea of that pain living on years and decades, in fact, after it happened. And I saw that time and time again. People, men and women, retelling the horrors of their lives, the most deeply painful experiences for the benefit of others, to educate them about the lack of humanity, about the dangers of people turning in on themselves. How difficult must it be to stand in front of a room like this and tell complete strangers that you've been raped? To do that time and time again. It must be incredibly hard also to tell a room like this that you've had attempts made upon your life. And I remember Bakira telling us that when we were sat in her office in Sarajevo. And I think at that point I read separately that Bakira had suffered 3 or 4 attempts at her life since the war. People who were scared of her telling her story, scared of her seeking justice. And Bakira very casually in passing told me this afternoon that somebody tried to kill her less than 10 days ago. This is a constant aspect of her life. She doesn't strike you as somebody that lives in fear. You heard from her tonight a distinct determination to do everything that she can to live her life, to hold those who committed these terrible atrocities to account for the crimes that they have served on her, her family, her people, and her kin. And she said to me that that's what she lives for now. If she dies tomorrow, she doesn't care. Her entire existence now is about serving justice on those particular individuals. So if you ask Bakira what her day job is, it's not necessarily travelling around European countries talking to roomfuls like this. She sits in a very basic office in the centre of Sarajevo, compiling reports about men who committed violent acts and raped women. And she works them up to a standard where they can be passed to the authorities, and the men subject of those reports can be realistically prosecuted for their crimes. She also, in passing this afternoon, told us that she could do more of that if she had a better computer. A computer that she can control, where she can keep the files and she can keep the spreadsheets. I think we all know there's enough people and money in this room tonight to sort that, and I will leave that thought with you. The sheer rawness of Bakira's story hits me every time I hear it. And the first time that I heard it was with Gail and Elaine Motion and Paul Hutchin, who's also here tonight, in a room in her office at the Association of Women Affected by Violence. And in this room, you saw some of it in the video, there was a picture of Bakira from maybe 10, 15 years ago in a magazine described as a heroine. I think our Bosnians all basic enough to have identified that, but what you didn't see was on the other sides of the room, there was a poster of one family that contained 73 people, all related to each other, who had all been killed by the Serbian forces. And the Serbian forces had come back to destroy the evidence of that crime and tried to set the house on fire. Bakira basically chained herself to that house and phoned the national media and said, if you're going to try and destroy that evidence, you'll have to go through me first. That's the strength of that woman that we've just heard from tonight. On the other side of that same room, there is a wall of mugshots of many of the most prominent men who committed some of the very worst of the atrocities, who are in front of the international courts just now. And it's like a tick box. One after the other, these men are being held to account for the crimes that they committed, and Bakira is never going to stop in pursuing that justice. It struck me when I was in that room that day that I'd never seen Bakira smile. And in a way, why would I? She was telling me the most horrific stories, surrounded by all of this horror. Why would she smile in that environment? But I saw her smile today, and that was when she was talking about her grandkids and having a laugh and a joke with the women that run the Glasgow Women's Library about their hair. And just the normalness of that struck me so very deeply. One of the other women that we met whilst we were was Munira from the Mothers of Srebrenica. And we had an opportunity, whilst eating the most beautiful cherries and apricots and drinking Bosnian coffee, to ask Munira, how is it you find the strength to continue to tell your story day after day? That must be so hard. Where do you find the strength to do that? And she said, no, you don't understand. It's the perpetrators that have it the hardest. And I couldn't quite believe that. And she went on to say, and I've got the direct quote here, let them cope with the miserable truth that they committed. Their lives are harder than mine. The grace of that, the dignity of that, the strength it must take to have said that. Another woman that we met whilst we were away was Dragana, who works in the Potakari morgue, is probably the best way to describe it. I don't think I fully understood where I was going and what I was doing until she opened the door of the cold storage and we walked in and we were surrounded by bags of skeletal bones, still all in the process of being identified. For decades now, Dragana has been working there, doing DNA testing on the bones, trying to piece together different lives. In front of us in one of the rooms, there was a skeleton laid out on the table, not dissimilar to the one that Lorna sat at. And Dragana very dispassionately talked us through the skeleton and said it was made up of bones, obviously, but 4 different sites had been excavated to find these bones. So there had been 4 different locations across Sarajevo and Bosnia where different parts of the same person had been found. It's the most horrific jigsaw that you could imagine. And that was the work of Dragana. The thing that I didn't know until I sat under a tree with Rishad afterwards was that Dragana was Serbian. She drove from Serbia every day into Bosnia to do that work because of that sense of injustice that she felt, her desire to give something back, to do the right thing. So I tell you those 3 stories just basically to say Bosnians are big people. They are huge people in their character, in their dignity, and in their strength. And you were probably struck by that most when you hear them talk about their ambitions for the future, what they want for their families and for their communities. And it's pride in their children, which was so apparent. Munira was sat there around her office table talking to us about the cultural differences between Bosnians and Serbians. And she said in Serbia they sit round a dinner table at night and say there's 4 or 5 members of one family. If there's 5, they'll lay out 6 places at the dinner table and they'll leave one empty. They'll put a plate down, but nobody will sit there. And that is a reminder to the family that their uncle or their father or their brother would have sat in that seat if the Muslims hadn't killed them. So they breed and they promote hate. They instill that in every generation as it goes by. The Bosnian way is different. The Bosnian way is to do anything and everything you can to ensure that revenge is not what is sought. It's justice. And there's a crucial and incredibly important difference there. People aren't seeking revenge, they are seeking justice. And Munira told us that the one thing she wanted more than anything in the world was for her granddaughter to have Serbian friends. Bosnians are huge people. Take that away with you tonight. So when we took Bakira to the Glasgow Women's Library today, we did a tour and then we sat down and we had some coffee and some obligatory Tunnocks caramel wafers and shortbread. And we started to talk about the similarity between the Glasgow Women's Library and the Association of Women Affected by Violence and how similar their stories were. They both started with absolutely nothing, not a penny, but the drive and the willpower they have in their own characters. Glasgow Women's Library's fared much better. It now gets government support running to the millions of pounds. The Association of Women Affected by Violence get to this day nothing from their national government. Bakira has done more than her government and her country have done for her people. That cannot be said here in Scotland. The theme that you've heard tonight and you hear time and time again is breaking the silence. And there's another similarity that I'll end with between the Glasgow Women's Library and the Association of Women Affected by Violence. And that's that sense of breaking the silence. Yes, it's about breaking the silence of women affected by violence, the strength you need to speak up about domestic abuse or rape or all these other crimes and horrific acts. But it's also about the silence of history and the lack of women's place in it. And that's what Glasgow Women's Library exists to do, is to give women their place in history so often denied by men. What we have to make sure now, I think, is that as we support Bakira in telling her story time and time again, we also make sure that history records what Bakira did, what women like Bakira did, and we don't repeat the mistakes of the past in that sense. So the trip changed my life, it changed my outlook. When I reflect about it now, I feel a sense of shame at the ignorance I had beforehand about what was happening in my adult lifetime. Just one Ryanair flight away from here, on European soil, how little I knew about that until I went. I feel a huge sense of pride at having met women like Bakira, and I also leave you with a huge sense of resolve to do whatever I can and whatever we can collectively do to ensure this never ever happens again. Thank you.
Remembering that lost generation, those men and boys who lost their lives 22 years ago. We light a candle to remember the thousands of women who were abused and defiled. We light a candle to remember the mothers who fight still for justice and continued search for their loved ones remain. We light a candle to remember those who still live with the horrors of those times. We light a candle to remember those who had to leave their homes, never to return. We light a candle to remember those who worked tirelessly in forensic to uncover the evidence.
Nebo nad nama, sjena je od
We light a candle to remember those who risked their lives to report the events.
sedam kata nebes.
We light a candle to remember those who risked their lives driving the 8 lorries during the siege. We light a candle in earnest prayer for peace and reconciliation. The future generations learn to live as one. We light a candle to remember all those who in the last year have been killed by terrorist attacks in the name of religion. We light a candle to pledge it will never happen again. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never be to extinguish that light. Light is stronger than darkness. Love is stronger than hate. And in the end, evil will not prevail.